Hello, Chris Nickel here, and today I want to talk to you about dodging and burning in Photoshop. Now, dodging and burning is a technique that comes out of the darkroom and has been adapted into Photoshop in a number of different methods. Now, the methods I'm going to show you today are just one of many options, but I find them to be among the most effective for a couple of reasons. One of which, like all the other techniques I want to introduce to you, they are non-destructive, meaning that they can be applied to your image without altering the original pixels, can be undone at any point, or can be revised at any point in the present or future of the image editing process. I want to show you kind of two general strategies here for dodging and burning that I think are the most useful and commonly applied. Now, as you can see from my layers panel, I've already done some editing to this image. I have this original image as my base layer, and then I have tone and contrast adjustments in order to create the look that I want for this image. Now, as you can see, this image has been edited to be a little dark and a little cool. I actually want to promote this fairly gloomy look that you see is pretty inherent to the image and the subject matter there. But I feel like the points of focus of the image are not quite what they can be. And this is really one of the primary motivations behind dodging and burning. Now, to define these terms so you understand them, dodging means selectively lightening specific areas within the image, right? And oftentimes we'll use levels or curves to make an overall adjustment to the tone, but with dodging, we're just doing it in these very, very specific areas with really specific intents. Burning, on the other hand, is the opposite of dodging. It's darkening the image in particular areas. And by lightening and dodging particular areas within the image, we can emphasize or de-emphasize particular areas. We can shift the focus of the viewer from one area to another, or the way that the viewer's eye moves through the image. I'm going to show you in this image here kind of the ways that I'd want to approach that. So the first method that I want to show you is the method that I like to employ for really precisely controlling adjustments in really, really small particular areas. To do this, I'm actually going to create a new layer altogether using this blank page icon, and I'm going to make sure that this layer is above any image layers that I have. So if you have photographs, multiple layers of photographs, if you've done some compositing, it should be above all of those, because anything that's below it is going to be affected. And typically we like our dodging and burning to affect all of the photographs. On the other hand, we need to make sure that our dodging and burning is below the adjustment layers, because we want them to be affected by the adjustment layers. So if we do end up deciding to make any changes to the tone or contrast, it will also affect those dodges and burns, so they will change along with the image area. Now, to make this effective, I'm going to have to employ a different blending mode than the normal. So in this case, there's kind of two different options, overlay or soft light. They more or less do the same thing, but overlay is kind of the general application. Soft light is a little bit of a more delicate approach. I use overlay because I'm able to have the precision of control that I want using that method. Now, what overlay does is it takes a medium gray as invisible. And anything that's lighter than a medium gray on this layer, it will lighten the tones below it. Likewise, anything darker, it'll darken the tones below it. Now, if you make something pure white or pure black, it'll make those tones pure white or pure black. So we're really working with a range of grays in between those two in order to have this sort of fine tonal control. Now, the way that I employ the dodging and burning here is using the very common tool of the brush tool, and I'm using it with just black and white. Now, if you don't have black and white currently set as your foreground and background colors, and the one in the upper left is your foreground and the one in the lower right is your background, you can revert to those colors just by clicking on this little tiny black and white square here, or just by pushing the D key, and I'll just demonstrate that really quick. I can pick nice bright red there. And if I just tap D on my keyboard, it will revert back to black and white. Now, to do this most effectively, I am going to have my opacity of my brush set very low, somewhere usually between 10 and 15%. I'm going to start with 12, and you can vary that in order to vary the intensity of the effect. Now, I'm going to zoom in here because there is this structure in the background of this image that I think is very interesting, and I want to have it stand out a little bit more. Now, in the process of dodging and burning, you want to make sure that you're just affecting the area of the image that you want to affect. And so you want your brush to be around the same size or smaller than the subject in the photograph that you want to affect. So I'm going to make my brush size a little bit smaller here, and I can do this using my bracket keys, which are really just the kind of hard parentheses, right angle parentheses, that you will see to the right of the P key. By pushing left bracket, it makes my brush smaller. By pushing the right bracket, it makes my brush bigger. Now, the other thing that I want to do here is adjust my hardness to be appropriate for how precise I want the edge of my dodging and burning to be. If you have a very sharp line that you are trying to trace, you're going to want your hardness fairly high, maybe around 80–85% or so. If you're trying to do a very subtle blending that's in kind of an open area, you'll want your hardness all the way at 0. In this case, I have a fairly defined object, though I don't want to have it precisely close lines, so I'm having my hardness set at, somewhere 34% here, somewhere kind of in the middle. And I'm getting this window up by right-clicking with my cursor while the brush tool is selected. And again, that is my symbol for my brush tool there. Now, I want to lighten this because I want it to stand out from the background, and to do that, I'm going to paint a very low opacity, again, 12%, white over the top of it. Right now, I have black selected. I can switch the black and the white by clicking this angled arrow here, and I can also do that by pushing X on my keyboard. As you begin to become more and more skilled in Photoshop, it is really useful to really get familiar with those keystroke shortcuts. It'll allow you to work much faster than you would otherwise. Now, you may not be able to see what I'm doing here because it's quite subtle, so why don't I go ahead and make it a more intense effect, and then you'll really be able to see what I'm doing. And hopefully you can see that as I paint over the area that I've targeted here, this little structure, the tones in it are actually starting to lighten up. And I've moved my opacity all the way up to 26, which actually isn't bad. I really want to have a pretty significant lightening effect on this structure. So that 26% may be appropriate. It is rare that you will be that high. Typically, again, somewhere in the teens tends to be more what the appropriate amount of adjustment is. Now, this is an effect that you build up over time. So what I'm doing is I'm clicking, I'm painting, I'm letting go. If it's not enough of effect, I'm clicking, holding down, and painting more. And I can actually that way affect some areas more than others. So if I want this little spot here to get lighter and lighter, each time I click and hold and paint, it will get lighter and lighter and lighter. And through doing this, I can really have this very precise sort of editing done to my image that allows me to say, I want this to really jump out, or I want this to kind of drift into the background. So as you can see, hopefully, if I turn my layer on and off here, you can see how much I've changed the image already through dodging, because I'm lightening the image, again, through dodging certain areas. That structure in the foreground really jumps out now. Now let's do some of the opposite. Let's do some burning. Now again, this is an opportunity to de-emphasize certain elements of the image through darkening them. So maybe I don't want that patch of water to reflect as sharply as these. I really want your eyes to move on these. And again, I can increase the size of my brush, maybe even decrease the hardness here. And I can even darken this middle ground here in order to kind of have your eye jump from the water over. Now, I don't like what I've done here. I think it's been a too extreme of a effect, so I'm going to push Command Z, go backwards, or I could go backwards on my history panel here, and then I can lower the opacity in order to lower the intensity of the effect, and try one more time. And now you can see it's really much more subtle in terms of how much I'm changing it. Darken this little clump of grass here, of dirt and grass. And, again, by just painting into certain areas, I'm going to make them kind of visually recede by darkening them. And as hopefully you noticed, the areas that I painted to make lighter, they can, come forward more in the image. So once again, I can show you guys that's the before and that's the after. And I've really changed the visual emphasis of this picture just by doing that. Okay, so let's look at one other technique that I like to employ for dodging and burning, and that is using masks combined with a curves layer, adjustment layer, in order to adjust the tone of larger areas within the image. In this case, the sky here is a little bit lighter. Like as I said before, I really want this to seem like a very gloomy scene. So what I'll do here is I'm actually going to take my lasso tool, and in this case I'm going to use the polygonal lasso tool because I find that this works very quickly, and I'm actually going to do something that's rather coarse in terms of the way that I approach it. And I'm just going to kind of trace it along the horizon here and up to the corners. There we go. And I'm actually going to go a little bit wide here, and I can bring it back and connect it. And if I double click, I should have a fairly large area selected. Once I've made my selection, I can come in and I can make a curves layer, and you should see that the area selected is what's going to be affected, and the area that wasn't selected is now masked off and won't be affected. Now, if you remember, within the Properties panel, I can click on this rectangle with the circle, and I can make adjustments to my layer mask. And this is going to be important because I'm going to want to blend this this burn that I'm going to do a little bit more subtly into the horizon, but I'm not going to do that at first, just so you can see what I'm thinking here. So what I want to do is I'm going to darken the sky down here, and I'm just basically using the curves as it's typically used, where I'm going to pull down on the line in the midtones to darken the midtones within the sky. I'm going to pull the highlights back up so that those stay bright, but you can see I can add a lot of drama to the sky by making this curves adjustment that specifically affects the sky area. Now you can see that where I created that edge of the layer mask is very obvious now. It is a hard line. So this is when I'm going to come over to the masks properties, and now I'm going to start feathering up. And you can see as I get higher and higher on the feathering, that edge gets blended more and more, and I can more or less control exactly how well blended it is to the point where that edge disappears if I feather it enough. And I've raised the feathering to over 100 pixels. This is a very high resolution image, and that's had a very good effect. So again, I should demonstrate best practices here, and I'm going to name my layers so I know what they're doing, and I will call this a sky burn. There we go. So I know what I've done there. And again, I can come in and you can see the really dramatic difference in the image with that sky burn. Okay, so finally, I will show you one more similar process, once again employing my polygonal lasso, and this would be to add a vignette to this picture. A vignette is a fancy way of saying I'm going to darken the corners in order to focus the attention towards the center of the image. Again, when you darken something, it tends to diminish its appearance. Now, this isn't universally true. If you have a very light picture and a dark object in the middle, the darkness actually enhances the strength of the visual pull of that subject. But for the most part, darkening will diminish the visual appearance and lightening will enhance it. One other thing that we tend to look for when we want to create visual balance is have our corners left to right be somewhat equivalent in their tonality. And I want to point out here that the left corner and the right corner are actually not the same. This right corner is actually quite a bit lighter. So I'm going to do a couple different layers of vignetting here, of darkening the corners, in order to do an overall sort of vignette and then specifically address different corners. And as I said, I like to use the polygonal lasso tool here because I can very quickly select large areas, and it's, I think, the best tool for doing this. And if I bring it back to the beginning, I should be able to get kind of a weird looking oval shape here. Again, if I create a curves layer, we'll go ahead and do that. Now you'll see I actually selected the middle of the image, so the middle is where the effect is going to take place, and I actually want to affect the outside. Easy enough, I just come to the mask properties and I invert, and now I'm going to affect the outside of the image. Same as before, I'm going to drop down the tone so it gets darker in those corners. Once again, I want to blend it so it's a little bit more seamless, so I'm going to crank that feathering up until I feel like it's disappeared. There we go, very good. And I still have that issue with the corners being a little bit different, so I'm going to come in here, I'm going to just select one corner. And boom, all right, very nice. Okay, I'll do another curves layer. And now you're starting to see that I'm building up lots and lots and lots of curves. And what I'm looking for here in this one is that my bottom right corner is about the same darkness as my left corner. It's a pretty subtle shift. And again, I'm going to want to feather that to blend it effectively. There we go. Okay. But over the course, I'm actually really building up lots and lots of layers here. And you can go, I know people who've done dozens of layers in trying to adjust their overall image. So in this case, if you have a lot of dodging and burning, I would actually recommend creating a new group. So I've selected all of my dodges and burns by holding down Shift while clicking the top one and the bottom one. I'm going to put it into a group, and I'm going to call it Dodge and Burn. There we go. And now I can kind of tuck those away so they're not interfering. Now finally, once I've kind of done all this dodging and burning, I may decide, well, I've really darkened a lot of the picture overall and want to decide to come back to my initial tone and contrast curve and lighten it up just a little bit in order to bring some of that back. Now, this is a great example of why we employ non-destructive editing, because it allows us to come back and continue to tweak our adjustments after the fact, so as that we can really work through the process and allow ourselves to try some things that don't work out and go backwards, or make tweaks further down the road to some of the first adjustments that we make if we don't like the way it was going. So I just want to show you, here's the original image. There's the new image, and here's the adjustments with the dodging and burning. And you can really see what a dramatic change I've been able to make through those two techniques, using a new layer whose blending mode has been shifted to overlay, and just painting in a very low opacity black and white in order to darken and lighten, in order to burn and dodge those specific areas, as well as having masked off areas that I have then added a curves adjustment layer to, and made a curves adjustment and then feathered it in order to blend it into the background. All of these adjustments here have really combined to create a much more dramatic image, I think, much more dreary, and also I have the eye of the viewer going much more where I want it to, which is to these reflecting pools and this little structure in the middle of the image. I hope you enjoyed this video and have learned something about dodging and burning, and will find it to be a useful tool in your own photographic editing.